Welcome to Starbound, where every star tells a story. What happens when humans get the chance to show the galaxy why the name human should chill them to their very core? Let's get into the story. The dawn broke like a shattered promise. Across the globe, people awoke to the familiar warmth of the sun, blissfully ignorant of the cold shadow stretching across the face of their world. High above, where the azure embrace of the sky met the infinite black canvas of space, a fleet of warships hung like predatory birds of prey. They were not there to admire the sunrise. The Vashari had arrived. Their vessels were colossal constructs of metal and malice, each one dwarfing the largest structures humanity had ever conceived. From their hulls pulsed an ominous, sickly green light, an alien aurora borealis that promised only darkness. On the bridge of the flagship, the Vashari general, Corvus, surveyed the blue marble below with detached amusement. His crimson eyes, like chips of ruby pressed into pale flesh, held no warmth, no admiration for the world he intended to claim. Such a quaint little world, Corvus drawled, his voice a gravelly rasp that scraped against the ears. To think they call themselves the dominant species. Beside him, a younger officer, his uniform crisp and his posture ramrod straight, shifted uncomfortably. "My lord," he began, his voice betraying the slightest tremor. "Reports from the scouts indicate the humans possess unconventional defense capabilities." Corvus threw back his head and roared with laughter, the sound echoing chillingly across the bridge. "Unconventional," he choked out, wiping a tear from one eye. What manner of primitive trinkets could these apes possibly possess to trouble a force such as ours? The officer swallowed, pressing on despite his general's dismissive air. "They have rudimentary projectile weapons, and their pilots." He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Their pilots exhibit an unpredictable combat style." "Unpredictable?" Corvus scoffed. "You mean undisciplined, unrefined. It is nothing we cannot handle." He turned back to the viewport, his gaze cold and calculating. "This world is ripe for the taking. Let us show these humans the folly of defying the Vashari Empire." Within hours, the order to attack crackled across the comms, a death knell echoing through the silent void. The Vashari struck with terrifying swiftness and brutal efficiency. Cities, once symbols of human ingenuity and aspiration, dissolved into fire and rubble under the relentless bombardment. The azure sky, once a canvas for dreams, became a canvas of fire. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming might, resistance began to flicker, small flames of defiance refusing to be extinguished. In the shattered remnants of their world, humanity would prove to be anything but easy prey. For they were fighting for their home, for their survival, for the right to exist, and that, as the Vashari would soon learn, made all the difference. The day had come when the galaxy would learn to fear the name human. This was only the beginning. The thunder of orbital bombardment shook Elias from a restless sleep. Gone was the familiar weight of a rifle in his hands, replaced by the alien chill of concrete in the pre-dawn light. He was no soldier anymore, not since the accident. Yet, his gut churned with a primal dread he couldn't ignore, a feeling he knew was mirrored in millions of hearts across the globe. Stumbling out of his meager dwelling, a repurposed shipping container near what used to be a bustling marketplace, he joined his neighbors. They stood in stunned silence, eyes turned skyward as the first tendrils of smoke began to rise from the horizon, painting the dawn a sickly yellow. The initial shock soon gave way to panicked shouts, a cacophony of disbelief and burgeoning fear. "By the stars! What is that?" gasped Mrs. Avila, her weathered hand clutching at Elias's arm. Her voice, usually brimming with life, trembled with a terror he could only understand too well. He pried her hand away gently, his own heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice firm despite the tremor in his own soul. "Help the others. I'll see what's happening." He didn't wait for a response. His legs, though unsteady, carried him toward the source of the smoke, a gnawing emptiness growing in his stomach with every stride. A lifetime ago, he would have been on the front lines, leading the charge, meeting the enemy head-on. Now he was just a broken man, running toward a fight he had no business joining. The city center, once a beacon of progress and human achievement, was now a scene from a nightmare. Buildings lay shattered, reduced to smoldering piles of steel and concrete. The air was thick with acrid smoke and the stench of burning metal, a grotesque parody of a factory floor. Amidst the devastation, he found them, survivors picking through the rubble, their faces streaked with soot and tears. He recognized a few: the baker, the young teacher from the academy, the old cobbler who always had a kind word and a warm smile. But their faces, etched with shock and despair, were masks of the people he once knew. And then he saw it. A Vashari dropship, sleek and predatory, hovered over the wreckage of what was once the city square. Its hull, a chilling bone white against the smoke-choked sky, pulsed with the same malevolent green light Elias had seen in his nightmares. He watched, his blood turning to ice, as armored figures descended from the craft, their weapons spitting fire and fury. These weren't the scattered attacks he had imagined, the skirmishes of a distant war. This was a systematic purge, a calculated display of power designed to cow them into submission. He stood there, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the devastation, the echo of his own past whispering warnings in his ear. But then, a sound cut through the haze of shock and despair, the defiant roar of an engine struggling to life amidst the wreckage. He turned to see a battered old transport truck, its paint scorched and its windows blown out, rumbling towards the Vashari dropship. Atop the truck, silhouetted against the inferno, stood a lone figure. She held a makeshift flag aloft, a simple white banner, a symbol of defiance against the encroaching darkness. And in that moment, Elias knew. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. He had to fight, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for that flickering flame of hope, held aloft in the face of oblivion. He had to fight for the chance, however slim, that someone might live to see the dawn break free of the ashes. The air, thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood, crackled with a desperate energy. Elias, his senses reeling from the carnage he'd witnessed, knew he couldn't fight this war with a soldier's heart. Not anymore. The city, his city, was burning, its streets choked with debris and the ghosts of those lost. The Vashari had brought their brand of calculated chaos, but they'd underestimated one crucial element: the human spirit's stubborn refusal to break. Ducking through a crumbling archway, he found himself in what had once been a grand library. Now, its shelves lay shattered, the floor littered with pages ripped from their spines, as if knowledge itself had been flayed open by the invaders. "They're out there butchering anyone they find." The words, choked with tears and fury, came from a young man huddled behind a toppled statue. Blood stained his tattered shirt, the telltale sheen of shock glazing his eyes. He was just a boy, barely old enough to shave, thrust into a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. Elias knelt before him, meeting his gaze. "What's your name, son?" "Reese," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Reese," Elias repeated, his own voice rough with emotion. "Where are your parents?" Reese shook his head, burying his face in his hands. A choked sob escaped his lips. It was a scene Elias had witnessed too many times, the raw, untamed grief of a life torn apart. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, the weight of his touch more comforting than any words he could offer. "Listen to me, Reese," Elias said, his voice hardening with a resolve he didn't quite feel. "We're going to survive this. We're going to make them pay for what they've done." As he spoke, a deep rumbling echoed through the ruined city, a stark counterpoint to the Vashari ship's cold, mechanical hum. It was a sound that resonated in his bones, a sound that spoke of power restrained, of fury held in check, the sound of hope. Leading Reese through the library's debris-strewn halls, Elias soon found the source of the noise. In what had been the grand reading room, now open to the smoke-filled sky, a sight met his eyes that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. It was a relic from a bygone era, a hulking behemoth of steel and determination. A tank. Its armor, though scarred and dented, still held the glint of defiance. And at the controls, her face grim but determined, sat Isolde. Isolde, their resident genius, the woman who could coax miracles from scraps of metal and wire. If anyone could turn the tide, it was her. "Elias!" she shouted, her voice barely audible above the tank's growling engine. "About time you showed up. I thought they'd gotten you too." "Just clearing a path," he yelled back, ushering Reese towards the metal leviathan. You planning on taking that thing for a spin? Spin? Isolde laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Darling, this is no joyride. This, my friend, is going to be a symphony of destruction. She slammed her hand down on a lever, and the tank roared, a mechanical beast awakened from a long slumber. It shuddered, gears grinding before lurching forward. Elias grabbed Reese, pulling him up onto the tank's back as it rumbled past, a steel island in a sea of fire. The Library of Shadows, once a sanctuary of words, was about to become a crucible of war. The rumble of Isolde's repurposed war machine echoed through the ravaged streets, a beacon of defiance in the smoke-choked air. Clinging to the tank's rear hatch, Elias felt a flicker of grim satisfaction as they rumbled past cowering Vashari patrols. Their sleek energy weapons, so devastating against buildings and defenseless civilians, seemed almost pitiful when faced with the raw, brutal mass of Isolde's creation. "Where are we going?" Reese yelled, his young voice barely audible above the cacophony of grinding gears and the tank's roaring engine. "We need to link up with the others," Elias shouted back, his eyes scanning the rooftops for any sign of movement. The boy, his face still pale with shock, clung to the tank as if it were a life raft in a storm-tossed sea, and in a way, it was. Ahead, a plume of black smoke billowed skyward, marking the location of what had once been a thriving marketplace. Now, judging by the sporadic bursts of energy fire and the distant roar of what sounded suspiciously like Isolde's handiwork, it was a battleground. "Hold tight," Elias warned, pushing himself up. He tapped twice on the hatch, a prearranged signal. A moment later it swung open, revealing Isolde, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of the control panel. "You picked a fine time to admire the scenery," she shouted, her voice tight with tension. "We've got company." Elias didn't need to be told twice. He hauled Reese through the hatch, dropping him onto the metal floor. The interior of the tank was cramped, smelling of oil and ozone, but it offered a sense of security the outside world desperately lacked. "Torben, report!" Isolde barked into the comm system, her fingers dancing over a bewildering array of levers and buttons. A voice, gruff and reassuringly familiar, crackled over the comms. "We're pinned down at the south entrance. They've brought in walkers. This thing pack any surprises?" "She's full of surprises," Elias muttered, eyeing the jury-rigged wiring and blinking LEDs with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "I rerouted the auxiliary power core," Isolde said, her voice taking on a gleeful lilt. "Let's just say they're in for a shock." As if on cue, the tank lurched violently, the sound of tearing metal echoing through the confined space. Reese whimpered, burying his face in his hands. Elias put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said, though the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Nothing about this was all right, but they had to keep going, for those they'd lost and those they might still save. Suddenly, the world outside the tank dissolved into chaos. A blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening roar, shook the very foundations of their metal sanctuary. Elias slammed against the bulkhead, the air knocked from his lungs. When he could see again, he saw Isolde grinning, her eyes alight with manic energy. "Target neutralized," she said, her voice almost drowned out by the ringing in his ears. "Now, about those walkers." As they rumbled toward the marketplace, a new voice crackled over the comms. It was high-pitched, urgent, almost lost amidst the static. "This is Linnea, do you copy?" Isolde's brow furrowed. "Linnea, where the hell are you?" "Above you, darlings," the voice chirped, a hint of amusement in its tone. "Though I'm not sure above so quite covers it. You might want to look up." Elias, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation, hauled himself up to the narrow observation slit. He peered through the thick glass, his breath catching in his throat at the sight that greeted him. High above the cityscape, against the backdrop of the burning sky, a single aircraft danced through a hail of Vashari fire. It was Linnea, piloting her battered scout ship with a grace and audacity that bordered on the suicidal. The Vashari ships, cumbersome behemoths built for brute force, were no match for her agility. She was a whirlwind of motion, her ship a blur of silver and fire, weaving through the enemy fire as if it were a game, her laughter echoing through the comms like a challenge, a promise of things to come. And somewhere beneath the fear and the bone-deep weariness, Elias felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. They were outgunned, outmatched, but they were not broken. Not yet. The human spirit, like Linnea's ship, was a thing of improbable strength and breathtaking resilience. It could soar above the ashes, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. And for the first time since the invasion began, Elias allowed himself to believe that they just might survive this. They just might make the Vashari regret the day they set their sights on Earth. The battered transport truck, christened the Kraken by Isolde in a fit of dark humor, shuddered its way through the ravaged streets. Reese, still pale and shaken from the encounter with the Vashari patrol, kept his gaze fixed on the floor, as if trying to disappear into the worn metal plating. Elias, perched on a crate opposite him, watched the boy with a pang of sympathy mingled with begrudging admiration. He'd faced his first taste of war with a stoicism that belied his age. First time outside the walls? Reese flinched at the sound of Torben's gruff voice. The older man, his face a roadmap of hard-lived years etched with soot and grime, leaned against a stack of crates, his gaze fixed on the boy. "Yes, sir," Reese mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't let it break you, lad," Torben said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It leaves its mark, that's for sure, but it doesn't have to define you." He paused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into an empty ration tin. "What matters is what you do with it, how you choose to fight back." Reese looked up, a flicker of defiance sparking in his eyes. "I want to fight," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I want to make them pay for what they did." Torben nodded, a grim smile playing at the corners of his lips. "That's the spirit, lad. But remember, revenge is a dish best served cold. We need to be smart about this. Hit them where it hurts, disappear before they know what hit them." Elias listened to their exchange. Saw a familiar ache in his chest. He'd heard that same thirst for vengeance countless times before, seen its corrosive effect on even the strongest souls. He'd pledged to never let himself be consumed by that darkness again. But the sight of the burning city, the memory of those lost, stirred something primal within him. The truck lurched to a halt, throwing Elias off balance. "We're here," Isolde announced, her voice tight with tension. "Remember, this is a snatch and grab. We hit the convoy, disable their comms, and vanish like ghosts." Elias nodded, checking his weapon. It was a relic, like so much of their arsenal, salvaged from a forgotten armory beneath the city, but it felt good in his hands, a familiar weight that settled the churning in his gut. They emerged from the relative safety of the truck into the stark reality of the ravaged cityscape. The air was thick with smoke, the silence punctuated by the distant crump of collapsing buildings and the sporadic crackle of energy fire. They moved like shadows, weaving through the skeletal remains of buildings, their footsteps muffled by the debris-strewn streets. Reese, his earlier bravado fading, stuck close to Elias, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Ahead, silhouetted against the burning horizon, a Vashari convoy snaked its way through the ruined streets. "Remember your training," Elias whispered, his mouth close to Reese's ear. "Stay low, stay quiet, and for God's sake, stay behind me." Reese nodded, his face pale in the flickering light of the fires. Elias could see the fear in the boy's eyes, but also a steely glint of resolve. He was young, untested, but he had the heart of a lion. Whether that was enough to survive the coming storm remained to be seen. As they approached the convoy, a sense of surreal calm settled over Elias. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet focus that had seen him through countless battles. He checked his weapon, the metallic click of the magazine a reassuring counterpoint to the chaos around them. "Ready?" he whispered, his gaze sweeping over the small group. Torben, his face a granite mask, raised his rifle in silent assent. Linnea, her eyes gleaming with a feral intensity, drew back the string of her bow, a single arrow, its tip coated in a viscous, glowing fluid poised to fly. Even Reese, his face pale but determined, held his makeshift weapon steady. This was it, their first real act of defiance, their chance to strike back at the invaders. This was their baptism by fire. The flickering glow of the burning cityscape painted grotesque shadows on the crumbling walls. The air, thick with smoke and the coppery tang of blood, felt heavy, oppressive. Elias crouched low behind a pile of rubble, his heart hammering against his ribs. Ahead, the Vashari convoy, a lumbering serpent of steel and arrogance, snaked its way through the ruined streets. His eyes met Reese's across the narrow alleyway. The boy, his face a mask of nervous anticipation, held a crude Molotov cocktail, its flickering flame casting a demonic glow on his youthful features. Elias gave him a reassuring nod, a silent promise he wasn't sure he could keep. This wasn't a training exercise. This was a desperate gamble against an enemy that outmatched them in every conceivable way. "Linnea, report," Elias whispered into the comms, praying the signal wouldn't be intercepted. Static crackled in his ear, followed by Linnea's voice, calm and steady, as if she were reporting on a training exercise instead of orchestrating a suicide mission. "In position. They're all yours for the next 5 minutes. Make it count, darlings." 5 minutes. 5 minutes to sow chaos and confusion, to cripple the enemy's supply line and buy themselves a few more precious hours of survival. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "Torben, you and Reese take the lead truck. Linnea will draw their fire. We need to hit them hard and fast, then disappear before they know what hit them," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames and the distant drone of Vashari patrols. Torben, a grim silhouette against the burning skyline, raised his weapon in acknowledgement. Beside him, Reese shifted nervously, his grip tightening on the Molotov. Elias clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through him. "Easy, son," he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. "Remember your training. Trust your instincts. You can do this." He didn't wait for a response. There was no time for doubt, no room for fear. This was it. With a whispered prayer to whatever gods might be listening, Elias raised his hand, signaling the start of their desperate gamble. For a heartbeat, there was only the eerie silence of the ruined city, the air thick with anticipation. Then, all hell broke loose. High above Linnea's ship, a silver wraith against the smoke-choked sky, screamed overhead, her cannon spitting fire and fury. Vashari energy beams lanced upward, painting the night sky with trails of sickly green light. But Linnea was already gone, her ship twisting and diving with an agility that defied belief. She was a phantom, a whirlwind of motion drawing the enemy's attention skyward, while the real attack unfolded beneath their feet. The first Molotov, launched with a desperate cry from Reese, smashed against the lead truck's windshield. Flames erupted, engulfing the vehicle in a roaring inferno. The Vashari inside, caught off guard, never stood a chance. Torben, moving with a veteran's grace, sprinted from the shadows, his weapon barking. 2 more Vashari fell, their energy shields no match for the sheer ferocity of his attack. Elias, his own weapon spitting fire, charged into the heart of the chaos. The Vashari, disoriented and confused, reacted with more instinct than training. Their energy weapons, designed for crushing rebellions on distant planets, were ill-suited for the close-quarters fighting in the labyrinthine streets. It was a chaotic, brutal ballet of bullets and blades, of desperation and raw courage. He ducked behind a toppled statue, the cold stone a momentary sanctuary from the storm. He could hear the Vashari shouting orders, their guttural language a jarring counterpoint to the rising screams of the wounded. But through it all, he could hear Linnea's laughter, echoing through the comms, a chillingly beautiful melody of defiance. 2 down, 3 to go, boys, she chirped, her voice a bizarrely cheerful counterpoint to the carnage unfolding around them. "Don't let the ladies have all the fun." He risked a glance over the statue's chipped shoulder. The convoy was in disarray, flames reaching skyward from the wrecked vehicles. But already the Vashari were regrouping, their bioluminescent tattoos glowing with an eerie intensity as they brought their superior numbers to bear. "Time to go," Elias roared, emptying the last of his magazine into a group of advancing Vashari. "Fall back! Fall back!" They retreated the way they came, ghosts in the ruins melting back into the shadows as quickly as they'd emerged. The air crackled with the energy discharge of dying weapons, the ground littered with spent cartridges and the bodies of the fallen. Elias didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. He'd seen enough death to last a lifetime. They regrouped in the rubble-strewn nave of a bombed-out cathedral, its stained glass windows shattered, its once sacred space desecrated by war. Reese, his chest heaving, sank to his knees, his face ashen, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I did it," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You did good, son," Torben said, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We all did." It wasn't a victory, not really. It was a reprieve, a small act of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. But as Elias watched the flames rise from the wreckage of the Vashari convoy, He felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to hope for since the invasion began. Hope. They were outgunned, outmatched, but they were not broken. The Vashari had underestimated them, dismissed them as primitive, easy prey. They were about to learn a very different lesson. They were about to learn that humanity, pushed to the brink, could summon a strength that defied logic, a resilience born of desperation and forged in the fires of survival. They were about to learn that the human spirit, like the phoenix rising from the ashes, could not be so easily extinguished. The sunken city of Eldoria. Once a sprawling testament to human ambition, now a crumbling graveyard of shattered concrete and rusted steel, half swallowed by the encroaching sea. Here, amidst the skeletal remains of skyscrapers and the haunting silence of flooded avenues, the human resistance clung to existence. Rain, heavy and relentless, lashed against the cracked windows of the makeshift command center, mirroring the storm raging both within and without. Elias, his face drawn and haggard in the flickering lamplight, studied the tactical display projected onto a salvage screen. It wasn't a heartening sight. "Their forces are converging on our position," Isolde said, her voice tight with tension as she adjusted a dial on her latest creation, a tangle of wires and repurposed Vashari tech that hummed with an unsettling energy. "Corvus is throwing everything he's got at us. He wants this city and everyone in it buried beneath the waves." "He's making a mistake," Torben growled, his hand resting on the hilt of his battered combat knife, a familiar gesture that spoke volumes about the battle-hardened veteran's current state of mind. "The bastard thinks this is just another rebellion he can crush. He's about to learn what happens when you back a cornered animal into a corner." "We're not animals, Torben," Linnea said sharply, her gaze fixed on the holographic map, her fingers tracing the contours of the submerged streets. Gone was her usual flippant humor, replaced by a steely focus Elias had rarely seen in the usually carefree pilot. "We're much, much worse. We're survivors." Elias, ignoring the byplay, tapped a finger on the map. "The sunken city is a labyrinth, a death trap for those who don't know its secrets. We use that to our advantage. Linnea, you and your team will be our eyes in the sky. Draw their ships into the canyons, cripple their air support." Linnea nodded, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Time to show these tin cans what a real bird can do in a hurricane." Elias turned to Torben, his gaze hardening. "You and your squad will hold the northern perimeter. Buy us time." Torben didn't argue. He'd been a soldier long enough to know that sometimes holding the line meant sacrificing everything. He saluted, a sharp, humorless gesture, then turned to assemble his squad. They were a motley crew, cobbled together from the remnants of shattered armies and civilian volunteers, but they were all that stood between humanity and oblivion. Elias watched them go, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the vast, empty chamber, then turned back to Isolde. She was hunched over her contraption, her brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers moving with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. "Is it ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Isolde straightened, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Let's just say I've borrowed a few pages from the Vashari playbook. They're in for a nasty surprise." The ground shuddered beneath their feet, the tremor growing in intensity until the very air seemed to vibrate. The Vashari were here. Elias drew a deep breath, the metallic tang of fear mixing with the smoke and ozone that permeated the air. This was it, the moment of truth. He activated the comm link, his voice, when he spoke, calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "This is Elias. To all units, may fortune favor the brave. Hold the line." The reply, when it came, was a ragged chorus of defiance echoing through the submerged ruins. "For Earth!" The battle for the sunken city had begun. The next few hours were a blur of chaos and carnage. The Vashari, their armor gleaming under the perpetually weeping sky, attacked in wave after wave, their energy weapons sending deadly arcs of green light scything through the air. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the ferocity of the damned, their makeshift barricades and salvaged weapons offering little more than a speed bump against the relentless onslaught. The air crackled with the discharge of energy weapons and the thunderous roar of collapsing buildings. The stench of ozone, blood, and burning metal hung heavy in the air, a grotesque perfume of war. Through it all, Linnea's voice, a calm amidst the storm, crackled over the comms, directing her team of pilots, her laughter, when she scored a hit, as chilling as any battle cry. Elias, his weapon hot in his hands, fought alongside Torben and his squad, their movements a grimly efficient dance of death. They fought for every inch of ground, every scrap of cover, knowing that each fallen comrade brought them one step closer to defeat. But slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. The Vashari, accustomed to crushing resistance with overwhelming force, found themselves bogged down in a labyrinth of their own making. The narrow streets, flooded and treacherous, negated their superior firepower, turning their advance into a slow, agonizing crawl. And every step they took brought them closer to Isolde's trap. The first sign was a high-pitched whine, building in intensity until it was almost unbearable. Then, the ground erupted. Geysers of seawater and debris shot skyward as Isolde unleashed her creation. The repurposed Vashari tech, drawing on the city's own power grid, created a localized EMP blast, frying their shields and sending their sophisticated weapons systems haywire. The effect was immediate and devastating. Vashari troops caught in the open screamed as their armor locked up, trapping them in their own personal hells. Others staggered blindly, their weapons firing at random, cutting down their own comrades in a frenzy of friendly fire. Elias, shielded from the worst of the blast by the thick concrete walls of a collapsed building, watched the carnage unfold, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. They'd landed a blow, however small, against an enemy that had seemed invincible. But it was a fleeting victory. A shadow fell over him, vast and cold. He looked up to see a Vashari dropship descending from the storm clouds, its belly hatch opening like the maw of some monstrous beast. From it emerged not the rank-and-file soldiers they'd been battling, but something far more dangerous. Vashari elites, genetically engineered killing machines, clad in heavy armor, their faces hidden behind grotesque skull-like helmets. News traveled slowly in the fractured remnants of the galaxy the Vashari sought to control. Whispers on stolen frequencies, coded messages relayed via jury-rigged transmitters, and the timeless tradition of hushed words spoken in the dead of night. All carried the same unbelievable tale. Humanity, the young, naive species confined to their single, unremarkable world, had fought back. Not only fought back, but won. The victory at the sunken city of Eldoria, a desperate gamble that should have ended in bloody defeat, had become a symbol of hope, a beacon of defiance against the Vashari Empire's suffocating darkness. The galaxy held its breath, waiting, watching for what might come next. On Earth, the rain had finally stopped. A watery sun, pale and fragile as a newborn star, struggled to pierce the smoke-filled sky above the ravaged city. Elias stood on the precipice of what had once been a skyscraper, the wind still heavy with the scent of salt and ashes, whipping at his tattered clothes. Below him, the survivors moved among the ruins, their faces etched with exhaustion, but also with a newfound determination. The victory had come at a cost. So many good people, gone. Torben, his gruff exterior hiding a heart of gold, had taken a plasma blast meant for Elias. He died with a wry smile on his lips, murmuring something about teaching those Vashari bastards a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Even now, Elias could still hear Linnea's anguished cry over the comms, a sound that tore through him like a shard of broken glass. "They know we're here now," Isolde said, her voice barely audible above the wind. She stood beside him, her usually vibrant face pale beneath a smudge of engine grease. "This changes everything. The galaxy won't ignore a victory like this." "Victory?" Elias scoffed, gesturing at the devastation around them. "This wasn't a victory, Isolde. It was a reprieve, a chance to catch our breath before the storm breaks again." "It's more than that, Elias," a new voice said from behind them. Elias turned to see Syra, her Vashari uniform discarded, replaced by the simple, practical clothes of the Resistance. Her normally stoic features were etched with a conflict that mirrored his own. Since her defection, her knowledge of Vashari tactics and technology had proven invaluable, but her presence still sparked unease among the survivors. Trust, once shattered, was a fragile thing to rebuild. "The Vashari, they underestimate the power of a symbol," she continued, her voice low and urgent. "The galaxy is fragmented, fractured by the Vashari's iron fist, but the spark of rebellion still flickers. And humanity, You have shown them that the Vashari can be beaten." Her words were proven true sooner than any of them could have anticipated. The first sign was a flurry of activity on the comms, a babble of excited voices speaking in languages Elias didn't recognize. Then, Linnea, her voice tight with disbelief, broke through the static. "We've got incoming, but they're not Vashari. They're here to help." Elias stared at the holographic display, his heart pounding against his ribs. A fleet of ships, their designs as varied and diverse as the species they represented, materialized on the outskirts of the system. They weren't a unified force, not yet, but their intent was clear. They had come to stand with humanity. The Vashari had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest, a footnote in their inexorable march across the galaxy. They had found something far different. They had awakened a sleeping giant, ignited a fire that threatened to consume their carefully constructed empire. The day the galaxy learned to fear the name human had arrived, and this was just the beginning. The command center was a tomb. Even the hum of the failing life support felt strained, a dying breath in the silence. On the holo display, the crimson noose of Vashari warships tightened around a pale, fragile Earth. No one spoke, but the grinding tension was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on them. Elias stared at the display, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Fear, a cold fist squeezing his heart, threatened to overwhelm him. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. He saw not just warships, but faces. The weathered features of the Eldorian farmers, their hope extinguished in a blaze of fire. The haunted eyes of refugees, their homes turned to dust. And Corvus, his smile a promise of annihilation. "He wants us to break." Linnea's voice was barely a whisper, but her gaze, fixed on the crimson dots, burned with defiance. "He wants us to beg." "He'll get ashes," Valen growled, his fist slamming onto the table, rattling the holographic projectors. The leader of the Free Earth Alliance, a man forged in the fires of resistance, seemed to embody the very spirit of defiance. But even his usual fire was tempered with a grim acceptance. They were outgunned, outmanned, out of time. Syra, usually a beacon of sharp analysis, remained unnervingly quiet. Her eyes, reflecting the crimson glow of the display, were dark pools of unshed tears. Even she, who had predicted Corvus's every move with chilling accuracy, seemed lost in the face of this inevitable defeat. The weight of their situation pressed down on Elias, suffocating him. Despair threatened to consume him, to extinguish the last embers of hope. But then he saw it, a flicker of determination in Linnea's eyes, a tightening of Valen's jaw, even a subtle shift in Syra's posture. They were afraid, yes, but they were not broken. He drew a shuddering breath, the air catching in his lungs. He had a choice. He could succumb to despair, accept the inevitable, or he could fight. He could meet the end with his head held high, his spirit unbroken. "We fight," Elias said, his voice hoarse but firm. It wasn't a question, but a statement of intent. His words seemed to break the spell of despair that had settled over them. Heads lifted, eyes hardened, and the air crackled with a renewed sense of purpose, however desperate. "The Whispering Woods," Garen, his face a roadmap of past battles, rasped, his voice barely audible. He unfurled a tactical map, his finger tapping a point near Earth. On the display, the region pulsed with chaotic energy, a graveyard of asteroids and debris. "A death trap," Valen muttered, his eyes narrowing. "And our only chance," Elias countered, his gaze unwavering. He saw it now, the glimmer of a plan forming in the darkness. The Whispering Woods, with its unpredictable currents and treacherous paths, was a death trap for the unwary. But for them, it could be a shield, a way to even the odds. "We make our stand there," Elias said, his voice gaining strength, conviction replacing despair. "We use their arrogance against them, turn their numbers into a weakness. They would fight, not for victory but for defiance, for the right to die on their own terms. In the heart of the Whispering Woods, among the silent echoes of shattered stars, they would make their final stand. The Whispering Woods, a name whispered in hushed tones throughout the galaxy, a place of unsettling beauty and unimaginable danger. Here, amidst the silent shroud of nebulas and the ghostly echoes of shattered stars, the remnants of humanity prepared to make their final stand. The bridge of Elias's flagship, a cobbled-together behemoth christened the Indefatigable, was a symphony of controlled chaos. Isolde, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of holographic displays, directed the fleet's movements with the precision of a surgeon, her fingers dancing across the control panel as she wove a tapestry of calculated chaos. "Vashari fleet approaching on our mark." Linnea's voice, sharp and alert, cut through the tension. Gone was the carefree laughter, replaced by a steely focus that spoke volumes about the stakes. On the holo display, the Vashari fleet materialized like a crimson storm cloud, their warships bristling with weapons dwarfing the ragtag collection of human and allied vessels. It was a David and Goliath scenario, a desperate gamble against an enemy that seemed invincible. "Remember your training," Elias said, his voice amplified across the bridge, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his crew, a mixture of seasoned veterans and wide-eyed recruits. Fear was a tangible presence, but so was determination, a shared refusal to bow before the inevitable. "We fight for our home, for our families, for the very right to exist. We fight for the future." He paused, drawing strength from the grim resolve etched on their faces. "And we make them pay for every inch of ground, every drop of blood. Today we show them what it means to face humanity." The first shots were fired, not by the Vashari, but by the humans. It was a calculated risk, a feint designed to lure the overconfident enemy deeper into the treacherous expanse. Vashari warships, their arrogance exceeding their caution, surged forward, eager to crush this pathetic defiance. What they encountered was not the disorganized retreat Corvus had anticipated, but a meticulously planned killing field. Mines, salvaged from derelict freighters and jury-rigged with Isolde's ingenuity, detonated amongst the Vashari formation, turning their own numbers against them. Asteroids nudged from their orbits by hidden beacons became deadly projectiles, smashing into unsuspecting warships with the force of celestial hammers. The Whispering Woods, usually a silent graveyard of stars, became a symphony of destruction. Explosions blossomed like fiery flowers against the backdrop of the nebula, each blast a testament to human ingenuity and desperation. "They fell for it, the arrogant fools!" Linnea crowed, her voice laced with a mixture of triumph and grim satisfaction. "Welcome to the grinder, boys." Vashari's ships, their formations disrupted, found themselves caught in a web of unpredictable gravitational currents and energy surges, their sophisticated systems no match for the chaotic forces of the Whispering Woods. "Direct all fighters to engage the enemy flagship," Elias commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "We need to draw Corvus out." They were outmatched, outgunned though, but they had one crucial advantage: Corvus's arrogance. The Vashari general, blinded by his belief in his own superiority, had made a fatal error. He had underestimated his opponent. The Indefatigable, its hull scarred but unbroken, emerged from the chaos, leading a squadron of fighters on a suicide run towards the heart of the Vashari formation. The Vashari flagship, a colossal testament to their vanity more than their tactical acumen, loomed before them, its guns blazing. Elias watched the display, his heart pounding as his small fleet braved a storm of fire to reach their target. Ships, their shields flaring, exploded around him, their sacrifice buying him precious seconds. "Garen, get us in close," Elias said, his voice tight with tension. "Linnea, on my mark, I need you to punch us through that cruiser's hull." "You're insane," Linnea said, her voice a mixture of awe and terror. "But that's why you're the boss." A heartbeat later, the Indefatigable, its engines screaming in protest, shot through the mangled wreckage of a Vashari cruiser, emerging within spitting distance of their target. Corvus had taken the bait. The Vashari flagship dwarfed their vessel, its hull a tapestry of cold, unfeeling metal. But Elias could almost taste the fear, the confusion, radiating from within. He had surprised them, outmaneuvered them, and now he would make them pay. "Boarding party with me," Elias roared, grabbing his rifle. "Let's finish this." The boarding torpedo, little more than a metal coffin packed with explosives and desperation, blasted free of the Indefatigable, rocketing towards the Vashari flagship. As the world dissolved into a maelstrom of fire and metal, Elias had a fleeting thought. This was it. The culmination of every battle, every sacrifice, every act of defiance. This was the moment when humanity, against all odds, stared down its demons and refused to blink. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they would survive this final, desperate gamble. But as he led his people into the belly of the beast, he felt a strange sense of peace. They had fought, they had bled, and they had shown the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. The echoes of their defiance would outlive them all.